We want to welcome everybody again to the Strengthening Board Engagement and Planning for Staff Succession webinar that's part of the Berea College Appalachian Fund Capacity Building Initiative, and we're really glad that you're here. We want to meet some of these objectives today. We're going to spend some time understanding board roles and responsibilities and how decisions are made on boards, understanding about officer roles and how to develop board members to then take those roles on. We're going to spend some time exploring how to plan for onboarding new board members. And then we're going to consider the importance of staff development for sustainability of an organization. And that's all related to this notion of leadership succession. And we're going to talk about and explore approaches to executive leadership succession and also leadership succession around board members. And how do we think about in terms of our board as well? I do want to share an important note, and that is that this presentation does not constitute legal advice for you all because we are not nonprofit attorneys.
Thank you, Donna, for getting us started. And thank you everyone for joining us today to learn about board development and engagement and planning for staff succession. We're glad to have you all here. Before we dive into the technical aspects of board roles and responsibilities, let's quickly cover the basics of a nonprofit board. A board of directors serves multiple purposes for a nonprofit, and we've got them listed on the slide here. The first is the board is the governing body of a nonprofit. The board also represents the interests of the organization as its legal voice, guides strategic direction of the organization, and lastly, leads the organization through important tasks and decisions. Now, while a board collectively serves these purposes, individual board members also serve specific roles. The roles that each individual board member serves provides clarity on who leads decision-making, how the board and its committees interact, the flow of communication among the board, and communication within the organization. First, let's take a closer look at overall board roles and responsibilities, and then we will delve into facets of each of these roles. From there, we'll transition into discussion of individual roles and what they are for a typical nonprofit board. As board members join a board, they commit to a set of roles and responsibilities as a part of the team that is the board of directors. Collectively, the board oversees the CEO or executive director, ensures healthy governance, stewards the organization's mission, serves as ambassadors for the organization, provides strategic leadership, and manages for financial sustainability of the organization. Now let's take a look at each of these collective roles in greater detail. So starting with supporting and supervising the CEO or executive director, the principal operational responsibility of a board is to select and oversee the performance of the organization's executive director or CEO, and most importantly, hiring that chief executive. This involves coaching and counseling so they can learn from the board's experiences and be successful in evaluating performance, determining compensation, and ensuring seamless succession. The most difficult aspect can be the decision to fire the chief executive. However, the more engaged the board is in its oversight responsibilities, the less likely it is to fire that chief executive. So it is crucial that the board has a good working relationship with their CEO or executive director. There should be a relationship between the board and the CEO, which maintains open lines of communication and transparency. And there is not a one-size-fits-all for directors. Different leaders will need different kinds of support. Another role of the board is to ensure healthy governance of the organization. The board's role in governance of the nonprofit focuses on two key areas, and those are achieving the organization's mission and ensuring the viability of the organization. So in order to do that, the board should, and we have these listed here, adopt and practice processes for making and implementing decisions that are in the best interests of the organization and will advance its mission. Additionally, the board should have a system for analyzing effectiveness and establishing accountability. A vital responsibility of the board is their own self-assessment. You should have at least a biannual opportunity to provide feedback, identify areas for improvement, consider additional supports, and hold each other accountable. Another facet of healthy governance is ensuring fiscal health and adequate resources for the organization. Being accountable for the organization's success means ensuring that it is fiscally healthy and has adequate resources. Therefore, the board must play a role in fundraising and make certain that the organization has enough resources to fulfill its mission. Board responsibilities include authorizing major borrowing, reviewing and approving major gifts as needed, establishing financial controls, and adopting policies that safeguard the organization's financial health. Next are bylaws. Bylaws are crucial for any nonprofit as they are the rules and regulations for internal management of the organization. The board is responsible for adopting and amending the bylaws, approving budgets and reports, reviewing and authorizing organizational and personnel policies, and establishing checks and balances. Board development. So in addition to ensuring that the organization has adequate resources for its fiscal health, it is also important for the board to consider what training and resources it needs to best support and strengthen the organization. Board development is the process of providing board members with training and resources to improve the performance and effectiveness of each director and ultimately of the organization itself. The board also carries legal and ethical duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. So let's take a look at each one in the subsequent slides. And after that, we will look at the board's responsibility to steward the organization's mission. So the first of those duties is the duty of care. As a key aspect of ensuring healthy governance, the board is trusted to act with a duty of care. As mentioned, there are 3 duties required for each board to carry out, and this is one of them. These are the minimum requirements for board membership and for the board to meet legal requirements. Duty of care chiefly requires that you act with common sense, informed judgment, and good faith when making a decision on behalf of the organization and its beneficiaries. The standard of care is that which, with the level of diligence, care, and skill that a concerned person would apply in a similar circumstance. It does not require the decisions of either individual directors or the full board always be correct. The critical point here is not whether the board does or does not act on a decision, but rather that the board acts and decides with a duty of care, with duty of care. A pattern of wrong decisions may result in changes to management, leadership, or membership. However, wrong decisions, regardless of how bad they may be, do not automatically result in disciplinary action or personal liability due to the business judgment rule. This applies as long as decisions are made in the best interest of the organization, in good faith, and on an informed basis with attention, common sense, and objectivity. The critical factor here is not the ultimate decision or result, but the process by which the decision was made. To have protection under this rule, directors must exhibit these basic behaviors that exhibit duty of care. And these are showing up to meetings, so attending meetings, both of the board and of any committees that they are assigned to, and of which they are members, receive the necessary information to make decisions, and if they don't receive it, to request it, ask reasonable questions to satisfy themselves that the information provided is complete, objective, and sensible, and that the actions proposed are consistent with the organization's mission and resources. And lastly, exercise independent, objective judgment. So the second of these 3 duties is the duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty is fundamentally about putting the interest of the organization before the interests of any individual or entity. You must make decisions you believe to be in the best interest of the organization and be fair in your dealings with the nonprofit, and must not seek to benefit personally from the activities or resources of the nonprofit. So that means conflicts of interest must be disclosed, that you keep confidentiality and maintain transparency. And also, there is a responsibility to act. And the responsibility to act prohibits directors from using their position of trust to further either their own private interest or the private interest of other persons or organizations. It requires that they have meaningful conversations during recorded meetings. You as a board member have the liberty and power to speak to issues, and please avoid having meetings outside of official meetings, and any conversations that are of significance need to be contained within an official meeting. And lastly, confidentiality. Anything said during a meeting should be kept within the meeting and recorded as appropriate. And lastly, of the three duties is the duty of obedience. Duty of obedience is about following the law, ensuring compliance, and reviewing bylaws. The duty of obedience holds board members responsible for keeping the organization on course. As a board member, you must be faithful to the nonprofit organization's mission, follow the organization's governing documents, and comply with state and federal laws. This is a part of the commitment one pledges when they join a board. When you hear the word obedience, you may ask, who am I obeying? And that is where you're obeying the law, ensuring compliance and adhering to the bylaws. Obedience is not a requirement for good behavior, but it is an affirmative obligation to keep the organization focused on its intended mission. This also means you must reflect the community you're working within. That means recruiting and onboarding new board members that represent the full range of backgrounds, views, and experiences in your community. Duty of obedience means that board directors must make sure that the nonprofit is abiding by all applicable laws and regulations and does not engage in illegal or unauthorized activities. This means that the board takes charge of and adheres to its mission, its certificate of incorporation and bylaws, established policies, and the law more generally. Now let's transition to the next collective board role, which is to steward the mission. The board's stewardship role reinforces many of the concepts of board leadership. Stewardship requires that the board keeps the organization focused on its mission. This means that your mission and vision are well understood by all board members, staff, and volunteers, and that the organization's goals and strategies will make meaningful progress toward achieving the mission. This also means that the board has a clear means of communicating this information to staff, typically through the CEO or executive director. Is your mission statement concise and inspiring to stakeholders? Are our revenue sources in line with the nonprofit's mission and values? Are new board recruits passionate about our mission? Do we choose the mission-serving option over the easy one? And how do we forecast and plan for change to avoid the temptation to broaden or change our focus? So up next, we'll look at the importance of serving as an ambassador for your organization. Your organization's reputation is one of its most vital and valuable resources. As a board member, you have a responsibility to maintain the trust of your stakeholders, beneficiaries, and the greater community. Being an ambassador takes this responsibility a step further and means that you engage people with the nonprofit by sharing your connection to the mission, experience with the organization, and how they can get involved. There are numerous ways you can cultivate relationships that are beneficial to the organization's mission and strategic goals. You can, and these are some examples here for you all. You can attend the nonprofit's functions, bring friends and network with attendees, engage with your nonprofit's social media profiles, contribute to the organization's newsletter, and encourage your contacts to join the mailing list, participate in fundraising efforts by hosting tours with donors or writing thank you notes, speak publicly about your nonprofit to community and service groups, and make an annual financial gift of an amount that is meaningful to you. And I just really want to emphasize here that it's important for each board member to donate, no matter how small the amount. That demonstrates that the board collectively believes in the organization and its mission, and that really speaks to funders and donors. So along with cultivating relationships, it is highly important to listen to community members as stakeholders of the organization's mission. Listening to the community and meeting its needs reinforces the organization's position as a mission-driven entity. The board of directors also provides strategic leadership in order to meet the organization's mission. So what does strategic leadership entail? The board of directors are in charge of the big picture, so holding vision for the organization as it meets its mission. The board is there to develop and communicate the organization's direction, goals, and provide a plan to get there. The board also leads the strategic planning process. This is the board's time to shine by providing expertise in strategic planning in order to strengthen and support the organization over the long term. The board also monitors and evaluates programs in order to sustain the organization's viability. The board also monitors outcomes, impact, and performance, and holds responsibility to serve as an ambassador by communicating these to stakeholders as appropriate or required. And lastly, the board approves financial statements and planning documents, which are great tools to further develop and inform strategic leadership. As a final collective role or responsibility of the board, let's take a look at managing for financial sustainability. In addition to all the roles and responsibilities we've covered so far, the board is also responsible for managing the overall financial sustainability of the organization. This does not mean that the board is involved in daily financial transactions or decision-making, but rather that the board periodically approves financial statements, fundraising efforts, and development plans, which staff operationalize and prepare for board approval. This requires that the board understands the organization's business model, ensures that management and staff have adequate systems to create accurate and timely financial reports, understands the organization's financial reports, which, for example, budget, balance sheet, income statement, audit report, annual financial report, and IRS Form 990. Also develop strategies to fund your mission that are realistic and support the business model. And lastly, follow state and federal regulations. And that includes filing 990, undergoing audits, and maintaining registration with Secretary of State and Attorney General. In this role, the board serves to provide guidance and oversight of the organization's financial strength. The board is also there to ensure that management and staff have adequate systems to create accurately and timely reported financials. So now let's talk about fundraising and friend-raising. These really tie back to being an ambassador. As stated earlier, it is important for each board member to donate, no matter how small the amount, to demonstrate their belief in the organization and its mission. It's about giving and making connections in the community. So building a board fundraising culture means that some board members might have strength of relationships and connecting with people, while others may thrive in project management and putting plans together. These are different roles that the board members can play. And collectively, with those individual talents and expertise, the board can really function at a higher level. And then with fundraising, this looks like building relationships with current and potential donors through researching donor preferences, assisting at fundraising events, facilitating introductions, and even hosting events with donor prospects. And lastly, solicitation. So that looks like contacting local businesses, service clubs, civic groups, and other prospective donors for resources for the organization. Along with the collective responsibilities as a board member, you can expect to commit further to individual responsibilities, one of which is to engage services of a professional. You should be able to reasonably rely on information from the organization's staff, its lawyer, accountant, insurance officers, and any other outside advisors to fulfill your responsibilities as a board member. In working to mitigate risk on behalf of the organization, the board has the right, if necessary, to engage the services of outside advisors at the organization's expense to assist it with a particular matter. Another responsibility is making reasonable inquiries. Before making any decision, board members should request and obtain all necessary background information and reports to promote informed decisions. You should use your own best judgment in voting and not be afraid to ask questions. Board members are asked to actively participate in board processes, and that also means properly fulfilling your duties as a board member, which requires that you must be active in organizational management. In practice, this means showing up to meetings prepared, asking questions to inform your judgment, reviewing the performance of the director, and protecting the organization from theft or mismanagement, among other activities. Simply put, if board members are not actively engaged and participating, then the total board cannot provide the full benefits and safeguards of its collective wisdom, judgment, and experience. Board members must know the identity and goals of the stakeholders, the demographic influences, political sensitivities, and key governmental relationships, and the flow of money. Organizational knowledge must be taught, and the board must demand a program for such teaching. The board should expect that opportunities and mechanisms be in place to provide not only basic information, but also continuous education. And lastly, around work ethic and attitude, if a potential board member does not have the time to prepare for and attend meetings, they should not agree to serve on the board. If a sitting board member's circumstances change and they can no longer put in the necessary time, they should voluntarily resign. There are, of course, hybrid responsibilities that straddle the individual and collective, and these are continuous improvement of the board's own performance and a commitment to ethics. That means acting both ethically and in compliance with the laws and regulations affecting the organization, and demanding both as individual and as a part of the board as a whole that the organization, its employees, and volunteers behave in the same ethical manner. So each board represents its organization, upholds roles and responsibilities, and here are some important points about that. Authority is collective. The authority of the board to take action on behalf of the organization is exercised collectively. This means that the board members have no inherent individual authority or power. Some organizations are big enough to have committees that work outside of board meetings. The leaders of these committees must make reports to the whole board and have the board vote upon and approve important decisions. Board members must not act unilaterally or actively work against the decisions made by the collective. Looking at government versus management, in most nonprofits, the board of directors takes on the role of governance and management, while the daily operations is the responsibility of the staff. In the simplest terms, the board of directors envisions the future of the organization, and the executive director operationalizes that vision. In working with an executive director, the board can expect the senior leader to manage the day-to-day responsibilities of the organization, including managing staff and volunteers, overseeing program implementation, managing budgets, and maintaining open lines of communication with the board. The executive director reports directly to the board and can expect the board to provide clear strategic direction, approval of reports and annual budgets, accountability in performing their governance function, and adequate supervision of the executive director's performance. The duality of chief executive's role as both servant to and staff leader of the board should not be overlooked. If the organization is to be successful, the chief executive must simultaneously lead the board and follow its leadership in a variety of situations.
I'm going to take a little time to talk and dive a little bit deeper into board structure. And board structure relates to how those decisions flow in your board and really how the work gets done. And so we'll start that conversation with a question that you might hear often is like, well, how many board members is the right number of board members for us to have with our organization? And the answer really is not a very clear answer. It's that, it's really that it depends. Now, the IRS generally requires a minimum of 3 board members. Now, that's not saying that they won't approve a nonprofit status application with boards with fewer than 3 members, but they will sometimes deny those applications if you don't have at least 3 board members. And then states can also have differing laws. And so the good rule of thumb probably to follow is that you want to have a minimum of 3 board members. But then a really good way to think about it is that you just really want to have enough board members to get the work of the board done, and then few enough board members for the board processes to be manageable. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But in any case, the bylaws should specify a minimum and a maximum number of board members. Now, some bylaws may have a specific number of board members that it says we are going to have 10 members on our board, and that is that. If you have that little bit of flexibility in your bylaws that says we have a minimum of 8 and a maximum of 12, it allows you then to adjust your board size to where the organization is at the time. So you can think about that in terms of structuring your board. And when we're talking about board size, there's no specified ideal board size generally. And I think we heard this as people were checking in. Generally, we have 7 to 13 board members. That is kind of a sufficient and manageable number of board members. Now, smaller boards can be more efficient. They can get work done more quickly. They could also, though, be more prone to burnout because people are really asked to do a lot more with that board. But that board size still needs to be unique to your organization. Larger boards also have some risks. They can risk individual board members getting lost in the crowd and potentially experience some inefficiencies. And so, how do you know if your board is too large? And in that case, you might find that it's difficult to schedule meetings. So you can't align all those schedules that have to be aligned to get board members to come to meetings. It can be difficult to make meaningful committee assignments to all members. If you have more members than you can assign off to committees, then those members may feel a little disconnected and not real interactive with the board. It can be difficult to have productive conversations or make decisions if you have a lot of people that have to be engaged in those. And then it can be difficult to recruit members if board member experiences are not really connected to the organization because the board is so large that you're not able to, people don't have a lot of generate a lot of excitement about the board. And your board also, it could be too large if it goes unnoticed that one or more board members has not been coming to meetings and nobody's really catching on to that just because your board is so large. The other thing that you want to think about when you're considering board size is quorum. And quorum means the minimum number of board members that you have to have present. And these are voting board members. So these are the board members that actually are voting on making those decisions. Those folks that have to be present to conduct the business of the organization. And that quorum is also set in your bylaws. And generally, I think a very common rule of thumb that organizations use is they say, we want to have a 2/3 member quorum here, voting member quorum, in order to make decisions. If we don't have 2/3 of our members in in a meeting where we're making a decision, then we can't move forward on decisions. That number can actually be flexed, or it needs to be in your bylaws, but your organization can decide what your quorum is going to be. It does have to represent a majority of the voting members of your board, though. So it could be anywhere from 51% up to 3/4 up to 100% of the board if you say quorum is 100%, which would be very difficult to do, I think. But so that's a little more information on board size. And I mentioned earlier, or maybe it said on the slide anyway, that states can actually dictate the size of boards also. And so I thought we might take a look at some of the states in Central Appalachia and see what their requirements are. And you'll see from this list, I highlighted a few things that show some of the differences in the way states dictate board membership. So the majority of them have a minimum of 3 members that they require. Virginia, though, stands out that they can actually have a board of 1 in Virginia. There are some term limits that are set by states. Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia. Let's see. Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia all say there's a 1-year term minimum for your board members. And so you have to at least give them a 1-year term. But then Ohio and West Virginia say that the term ends when the successor is elected, a qualified successor is elected to replace that board member. And so that could potentially be a shorter term or a longer term, if however you want to look at that. Tennessee actually sets a maximum on the number of terms that, the length of a term that a board member could serve. And so they have 5 years maximum, a 1-year minimum term and a 5-year maximum term. And Tennessee and Ohio also requires some specific officers for your board. In Ohio, it's the president, secretary, and treasurer are required by law. So your board has to have those positions. Of course, we would recommend having those positions anyway. But Tennessee also requires by law for a president and a secretary to be required. And then you can see there are some other nuances in there that, some offices can be held, same individual can hold more than one office. And in Tennessee, they're saying, well, you can do that except for the president and the secretary. Those have to be held by separate people. State laws can also provide guidelines for how committees are formed. And we're going to talk about committees a little bit later. But they can set regulations about the number of members that have to be on a committee, whether the committees have to actually include board of director members, or whether you can bring in other people to be on those committees. So if you have a very small board, in some situations, you may want to bring on volunteer community members to help with a committee, or constituents even, or perhaps staff of the organization if the board decides to do that. But you just need to know what is going on in your state in terms of state laws. And so you just want to maintain compliance with that. And that's where having an attorney on your board can help with that. So let's talk a little bit about the board structure and leadership positions. What about those officers? And so, we mentioned that some of the regulations say that you have to have a president, secretary, and treasurer. And so what is it that those officers really do? So really the typical officer positions really do include those three things: the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. The president of the board is generally responsible for presiding at meetings, and so they're actually facilitating and running those meetings. They also would be the one to sign documents and contracts that are approved by the board. So they don't unilaterally sign those, but if the board approves some sort of contract that has to be signed on behalf of the board, then it's the president that does that signing for those documents and contracts. The board chair also assists the executive director in preparing meeting agendas, and so they work very closely together throughout the coordinating the work of the board between the executive director and the board chair. So the board chair is really a point of contact for that executive director, so they're not being bombarded with a lot of different viewpoints and opinions and a lot of different voices. All those voices are channeled through the board chair. The board chair also is responsible for conducting and coordinating the executive director's annual performance review. They may also bring in other board members if they want to do more of a committee approach to that, but that really falls within the duties of the president of the board to do that, or the chair of the board. Then the secretary. So, we often think of the secretary's position as somebody who just takes notes. But that person is responsible for actually maintaining compliance and showing that the board has maintained compliance regarding the organization's record keeping, because there are, rules about taking those minutes, making sure that they are accurate, recording decisions that are made. The secretary also may help schedule meetings and comply with notice requirements. If you have a board that is having to put out public notice about your meetings, those are generally kind of public boards that have to do that, but the secretary would be involved with that. And complying with those notice requirements, maintaining, again, those complete and accurate meeting minutes, and assuring that the organization's corporate records are filed. So the secretary works with the board in order to make sure that if there's anything, and probably works with the executive director also, if there's anything that needs to be filed for the organization, then that board secretary can at least be reminding people that they need to get those things in. And then the treasurer manages the budget, tracks and keeps the rest of the board apprised of the organization's financial position, essentially. They can take a lead in an annual audit. They probably chair if your board, and we're going to talk about committees, a common standing committee for a board is a finance committee, and the treasurer will typically chair that finance committee. And they'll work with the executive director, or if it's a larger organization and has a finance director or a CFO, then they may work with that chief finance officer to provide the board with very clear, accurate, understandable financial reports prior to the meetings, so that people have time to review those. And then they also will participate in annual audits. They will work with the executive director or the finance staff to ensure that tax forms are filed in a timely manner. And they will participate in the development and approval of the annual budget. So they'll help bring that budget to the board. An optional position that you could have with your board that you might keep as a kind of a standing position like this is the vice chair or vice president. This actually is, and we're going to talk a little bit about succession planning for boards and for organizations, but if you have a vice chair or a vice president, you could be moving that person into the place of then stepping into the board chairship with holding the skills and the experience that they need. And so this person would serve as a backup leader for the board. They could run meetings in the absence if the board chair or the president couldn't be there. And they can complete special duties as requested by the board chair. And so again, it can be a good way to plan for succession planning. All of these officer positions should have position descriptions. In fact, every board member should receive a description about here are our expectations about your service on this board and what we expect of you. And those position descriptions should probably include things like those duties that Colby went over earlier, that you have a duty of loyalty, a duty of obedience, and a duty of care. So keeping those in the position descriptions as well, just so that people understand. I think folks join boards sometimes and they never know that those are expectations in general of board members. So if we think about how boards are really organized and how decision-making flows and how communication even flows here. And Colby touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about how the board chair and the executive director are really the ones who are working together, and communications from the board to the executive director should probably come through the board chair in most cases. You know, if there's a special committee that's assigned to work with the executive director, that would be different. But even those board committees then are reporting up to the board of directors, which then reports up to the board chair. Under no situation should board members be going to staff of an organization and making demands of staff or telling staff to change the way they're doing things. All of that kind of staff operations and what we're calling line operations, which would be programming operations in an organization, should come down through the executive director. So the executive director is overseeing those things. And so just keeping in mind that the way communication flows and the way that decisions are made, that everything should really work its way up to the board chair. Those board committees should not be making decisions unless there's a resolution passed by the board that says this board chair or this board committee can make a specific decision and then come back to the board with it, and the board will adopt it. But committees typically make recommendations that are then posed as to the board to be adopted. So those recommendations are posed to the board to be adopted. And so by following this kind of governance structure, you can prevent a good deal of confusion and conflict among who's piloting the ship at the operations level. And the board, again, is doing governance and not that detailed management, as Colby mentioned earlier. About decision-making. And so the board is responsible for making really important decisions that impact the success of the organization. Voting is one decision-making method. And what we've outlined here is a very kind of a short outline of the way Robert's Rules of Order would work. And that's a very typical decision-making process that boards use. Now, maybe not all boards use those, but we don't have time to go in depth into Robert's Rules of Order. But let's say a committee comes back with a recommendation and the board wants to make a decision about that. And so the decision requires a vote. And so if somebody makes a motion that the board make a specific decision about the recommendation of the committee, that motion is made, another board member seconds that motion. All the people who are present then have an opportunity to be open for discussion and to ask questions and discuss that. After discussion feels like it's has been had, then the board chair can ask for a vote. And each board member casts a vote of yay or nay, and the results are very clearly recorded in the minutes so that there is a very concrete record of how that decision was made. Now, again, the board could also, I said earlier that committees or staff members might, by resolution of the board, be allowed to make some decisions and have the authority to do that. But the board has to ultimately say we're allowing this, and that needs to be recorded in the minutes that says, yes, we're allowing this committee to make this decision. And so that is, well, I'm trying to think of an example. So I chaired a search committee for a nonprofit board, and the board officially voted to allow our committee, the search committee, to recommend the top 3 applicants for the leadership role of the organization. And it's important to note that this was not a hiring committee that I was on, but it was a search committee. And so we were not allowed at that point, and it was very expressly told to us, you don't discuss salary, you don't make any negotiations, but you make a recommendation to the board. And then so we brought that recommendation back for some candidates, and actually we brought the top candidate back and made that recommendation, which was ended up being unanimously accepted by the board. And then the board made a resolution or made a decision to empower the board chair to make an offer to the top candidate. And so you can see there's a whole process of decision-making where the board is weighing in on the decision and actually officially, staying with, having people stay within the scope of what they're empowered to do as board decision makers. So there are some techniques that I wanted to go over really quickly about when you're not, this is not Robert's Rules of Order, but if you're thinking about, I need to strengthen my board's decision making, that yes, we try to do things with Robert Rules of Order, but we don't really get a lot of time to discuss things, or sometimes we just want to check the temperature about something with the board and how they're feeling. And so some of these techniques include decision sequencing, so that you can require that issues be presented throughout several meetings before a decision is made or before a vote is allowed. And this is particularly important for big picture things where you want to allow thorough discussion and consideration. If there are complex decisions that boards are going to be having to make, then they need a lot of information and they might need time to think about that information. Decision sequencing could happen if you are trying to create and approve a strategic plan as a board. You go through a process of that plan, and the board needs to be very familiar with what's in that plan before they make the decision. And so sequencing the way that plan is presented before a decision is made is really important. So it's kind of a phasing in process for the decision making. And then there are non-binding straw polls that can happen. And these are almost like informal voting kinds of things. And I don't know if anybody in this group, a common thing that we use is at Brushy Fork is we'll do a straw poll using dots on a flip chart if people have a list of things that they've come up with. And people can say, add dots to your top 3. And so it's not an official voting process, but that people can look at a list and pick their top 3. And it just kind of gives some idea of the temperature in the room and can allow people who are kind of stuck in positions. If you've got a lot of conflict on your board about a decision you're trying to make, it gives you a visual way, especially if you use those color dots, to see where the majority of the board stands, and can just get people to think differently and maybe move out of stuck positions. Then there's fist to 5 polling, which is about your hand, right? And so it's a hand raising system to express levels of support. A fist means no, this is absolutely not. 5 fingers means I fully accept and really feel excited about what it is that we're going to vote on as a yes to whatever it is we're voting on. People can do fingers in between. They're not feeling so great about it. They could do a 1, they could do a 2, they could do a 4 if they're almost there and not quite there. Again, this is a technique where, if you've got a board chair that's kind of trying to facilitate a discussion and it's not clear where the group stands, then they can use a fist to 5 and see how many fists do we have in the room. Okay, it looks like we've got half the people here who are holding up a fist that says this is a no-go for me. It just, again, gives the temperature of the room and lets the president or the board chair know that there's probably going to need to be some more discussion before a vote, or the vote just needs to happen and this is not something that's going to pass. And so, you would just want to be really careful that this is not used to prolong a discussion when it doesn't need to be prolonged. There could also be situations where you could require a supermajority vote for really critical decisions. And so the board would need to really think about when this kind of instant would be appropriate. And, supermajority, again, what does that mean? That probably means way more than your quorum, almost 100%. This might include decisions like, let's say the executive director has had performance issues. The board is trying to determine whether they want to let this person go. Is that going to require a supermajority of people to say, we're going to let this person go? Are we going to make a significant change to the bylaws? The bylaws are the kind of core document of how the board operates. And so are you going to, to make amendments to that without a supermajority? Probably not. So those types of really big decisions that really change the way the board or the organization works could be done with that supermajority requirement. You can also use secret ballots. Now, in our work with Brushy Fork, we always advocate for transparency in leadership because we believe that's important for people. But There could be times that you have a super controversial decision and you want to allow board members to vote without pressure. And then there could be a secret ballot. And let's say that you are in a situation where you have a very ineffective and inactive board member, and the board is trying to determine if, let's say there's a committee that brings forth, if you have a committee on governance on the board itself, and that committee says we have some inactive board members and we want to decide whether or not these folks should remain on the board or whether we should replace them, maybe you could do that by secret ballot. Just a thought. And then think about avoiding decision fatigue in the way that you structure your board agenda. If you have really important decisions to be made, just basically, if you have a long board meeting, don't put those off till the end of the board meeting. Place those significant decisions early in the meeting so that people are kind of fresh and have their brains aren't taxed yet from a lot of discussion, and people can fully engage in that decision making. So I know that was a quick overview of those, but those are some techniques that can help you strengthen board decision making. So let's talk about board composition, because boards are made up of people, and it's those people that are going to be taking those officer roles and forming the committees and all of that. So we're going to think about what is the mix of people, the qualities and the skills that need to be woven together to really maintain an effective board and to keep that board fresh. And there are two key factors to think about when you're designing your board membership. And the first is board diversity. So diversity can actually be the root of your board's credibility. And the reason we say that is that if you have a strong, diverse group of people, you're going to have the skill sets that you need. You're going to have representation from the people that you're serving with your organization if your board is diverse. So you're going to represent really the complexity of the people you're serving and the complexity of the work that you're doing. So your board really should reflect and represent the complexity and the differences of its community of stakeholders to have credibility with the constituency that you serve. And so those board members should bring skill sets, and they should also be able to relate to the folks that you're working with. Without this kind of diversity, your board could lack these things. They could lack being accepted by the community that you're serving. They could see your organization as just listening to outsiders and not bringing in the community. So your board might not be very well bonded with the community if you don't have that kind of diversity. It might lack understanding of the substantive needs within the community, and the community may not believe in your board and what it does and how it does it. And so just thinking about that in terms of diversity, and you might look when you're thinking about diversity in terms of age and gender and sexuality, race, religion, culture, geography, education, socioeconomic status, professional skills that you need, and the backgrounds that you need to have the board be effective, and also abilities, because all of these different diverse people bring those kinds of valuable perspectives that you might need. And then there's something that we call board luster. And board luster is about reputation. And so when you are asking people to be on your board, you might think about how controversial is a person that I'm asking. They may have a great skill set, but they may be controversial in the community for some reason. And so who is on your board should not be a negative factor of the board. And so, there should be a process of determining, and we're going to talk about qualities that you're looking for and skills that you're looking for, but there should also be a process of saying, what are the social factors that we need to think about regarding inviting this person to be on the board? So who is on your board should not be a negative factor, and who is not on your board should not be a negative factor. So when you're thinking about board members to bring on, then you want to make sure you're being inclusive, essentially. And so the addition of any new board members should add attractiveness to the board. You should use the composition of the board to enhance the public's trust in your organization, and not only the public's trust, but your funders' trust. If the funders sometimes will ask you for a list of who is on your board, and they want to see that diversity. They want to understand that you have constituents that you're serving on your board, and so those are just things to keep in mind. The composition of the board as measured by the reputations of the individuals that compose it should serve as evidence that the organization is well run and doing serious and important work. And so that's speaking to the constituents that you're serving, to the stakeholders that you have that are providing resources and funding to your organization. That composition of that board is important in both those areas. And so as you are thinking about, I mean, when you bring board members on, you should almost be thinking about them as if you are hiring somebody, you're hiring an employee. And so there are certain qualities that you want to see in board members. Board members want to have a reputation for having this sense of integrity. They should demonstrate zero tolerance for unethical behaviors, both for themselves and for colleagues. And so they should just behave well, right? They should have some independence from in the decision making. So they should have no unique business, financial, or personal relationships, or relationships that they're trying to build that could create or even just could actually create or even create a perception of a conflict of interest. So if you've got somebody who's joining your board because they want to try to get a contract with a group that your organization works with, there's a conflicts of interest. They should not have, they should have independence around that. They should have mature confidence. They should be willing to speak out and actively engage with the board in decision-making and in committee deliberations. They should show up for meetings. They should, when they get there, actually participate and share opinions and thoughts and skills that they bring. So that mature confidence. They should have what this is referring to as corporate manners. So they need to recognize the difference between productively participating in discussions, and so bringing good quality, even if you're dissenting against something or not, not in agreement with something the board's discussing. How do you do that well? How do you use those corporate manners to do that without counterproductively dominating deliberations or bringing negativity that doesn't allow things to move forward? And so you want to seek out those qualities. They need to have a sense of the context of the organization, and they want to make and the discussions that are happening. So they want to be making relevant and informed comments that are focused on a specific aspect that's being considered. So you don't want to be bringing in things from out of the blue that folks are going, that's not really related to what we're talking about. Board members need to be a little bit courageous. They're taking on some risk when they join a board. So they've got to exhibit the willingness to do the right thing and to make the right decision, even if it is difficult or unpopular in a situation. So having that courage to do so. And then just that commitment, Colby talked a little bit about this earlier, that, you have this, the loyalty duty. So understanding that being an effective board member requires time, it requires your heart, and it requires the standards to make the organization successful. So you're going to exhibit that loyalty to the board. And then there are skills too that you want to think about with your board. Financial literacy, so being able to understand and read financial statements. If you get board members that don't have that financial literacy on, there could be an opportunity to provide some training to board members. And so there could be some board development. Colby's going to talk about board development a little bit later, so that people understand how to read financial statements. And so there could be a process as you're onboarding people to help them understand that. They need to have community literacy, this ability to decipher and empathize with the service needs of the organization's stakeholders. So if they don't have an understanding of where you're working and who you're trying to serve, they may not be the best board member. They also need to have some political literacy. They are ambassadors. Colby brought that up earlier. They're ambassadors for the board. They need to have the ability to build the coalitions that are needed to serve as a good ambassador, not only being able to lead, but also being able to follow and knowing when to do which. How do we make connections outside the board? How do we bring stakeholders in at the right time? So that kind of political literacy. And then communications literacy. They need to be able to convey a point of view in a manner that's efficient and understandable and contributes to the flow of the board's deliberations. Thoughtfulness. So they need to be thoughtful in the way that they speak and when they speak. Brevity. So, you don't want to have a board member who takes up half the board meeting talking, and they need to be able to stay focused. And then mainly just good judgment and a willingness to learn. So let's move on and talk a little bit about committees then. And so what is the purpose of a committee, of course? Well, every committee needs a charge, and the charge outlines the purpose of the committee. These committees are really vital tools to get the work done on boards. And so, the board as a whole is not going to be able to get every bit of very concrete work done that the board needs to accomplish. And so committees allow the boards to increase that productivity. And the board has the authority to establish committees. Some of those are going to be designated in your bylaws, particularly these standing committees. Your bylaws should designate those. But the board can determine whether they want to have those, whether those standing committees need to be there, and they also can form those ad hoc committees, those short-term committees. And so the question the board might ask itself is, do you always need a committee for everything? Is there a way to put together a smaller working group that then can bring something back to the board that's not an official committee? So some boards can operate a little less formally that way, so that they're bringing those working committees, or I'm sorry, working groups that are not official committees. But the value of having committees is that those committees have a charge and know what they're supposed to very clearly bring back to the group and to the full board. Let's take a quick look at these different standing committees. So the executive committee is the first standing committee, and that executive committee primarily exists, or really almost always exists, of the board officers. And it's empowered by the board to make some decisions, to take limited action on issues that arise between meetings of the full board. So that is something that, again, could be outlined in the bylaws, or if the board says, we want the executive committee to take on this decision-making role between now and the next board meeting, then the board would pass a resolution at the board meeting where they're having that discussion that empowers the executive committee to make that decision and then bring it back to the board at the next meeting. So if it's not laid out in the bylaws that an executive committee can make a specific decision, then there needs to be a board resolution that empowers the executive committee to make a specific decision. Finance committee. The finance committee is often chaired by the treasurer. I think we might have mentioned that earlier when we were talking about the board officers. Generally, they work with the finance committee works with the organization's financial director, or if there's a bookkeeper to keep track of the organization's financial health. They're usually responsible for reviewing financial reports ahead of board meetings and being ready to report out on those. They want to ensure that the organization has the proper financial controls that it needs. And so you need folks on that finance committee that have some financial experience. And they may also find themselves participating in audit processes as well. And then the fundraising committee, sometimes called a development committee, is another standing committee that is responsible for conducting fundraising for the organization, right, to bring in revenue. And its responsibilities typically it's not to do all the fundraising, but to coordinate with fundraising staff, to coordinate with other board members, to help develop a fundraising plan, and to involve their fellow board members in fundraising activities. And so it's that fundraising committee that's going to talk to folks about on the board about, have you made your donation yet? It doesn't matter if it's $5, please make your donation. And then they may also participate in doing donor recognition as well, as long as they're coordinating that clearly with staff at the organization. So, and then we have some of those ad hoc committees that could be formed. Things like if the board says we want to have some board development, or we want to do an assessment of how the board's operating, then you could create a board development committee. If it's time for an audit, there could be an audit committee that is developed to work in collaboration with that finance committee. There could be a human resources committee that gets set up, where responsibilities could consist of, let's say you want to do a market study of the wages. And so, we're reviewing personnel and compensation policies. And so the board could put together a human resources type committee to do that. So, the size of the organization and the size of the board can really impact how you do these different committees. So, and bylaws should clearly define the purpose, powers, procedures, and limitations of the committees. And so committees should also maintain and distribute minutes back to the board and those appropriate records and report the way they deliberate should be reported to the full board. Committee membership should be structured to reflect the full composition of the board also, so that you've not got the same people serving on committees over and over, but you've got the full board serving on committees in some way. Those standing committees that we talked about are really the core of the organization's infrastructure and should be specified in the bylaws. I mentioned that earlier. That includes their purpose and objectives, the size of members they should have, so your bylaws should talk about that, and the mix, as well as designating by office or by position the who's going to be chair of that committee. Those committees will continue to function until there is a change to the bylaws. And so if a committee is no longer needed, the bylaws have to be changed. Special committees have a limited purpose and a limited life. They are created to address a specific or special purpose or issue, and they are dissolved once that task is completed and the committee's work is ended. And they're good for addressing specific issues without creating that governance overhead of a standing committee that could get in the way of efficiency. So bylaws should establish, again, how your committees are established, especially special committees. And so there should be a process in your bylaws that says, here's how the board creates a special committee. We go through this process. And can the committee be appointed by a board chair, or does their creation require the action of the full board? Is special committee membership limited only to current board members? Or can you bring in outside people to a special committee? And so that could be specified in the bylaws, whether it's allowable to bring in outside folks if you need that kind of professional advice, let's say, or you want to bring in a constituent that you're serving. If non-members, and this means non-board members, are eligible to serve, special committees can be a valuable way to keep past board members and friends of the organization involved. And so if you need people with experience, if you have board members that have cycled off, you can bring them into special committees. And it can also provide a way to introduce potential future board members to the board and to evaluate their readiness and their interest and their fit. And so there could be some benefit in allowing non-board members to serve on committees.
For this next portion, we will look at board recruitment and onboarding processes. How the board manages these processes is vital to the success or not of not only recruitment and onboarding, but the strength and success of the board. Its ability to govern, hold effective meetings, make important decisions, hold executive sessions, and accurately record meeting minutes. One important tool is the board notebook, which is a functional tool for organizing your board materials and orienting new members. A board notebook should include copies of important information your board of directors need to have at hand. Resources most commonly found in the board notebook include governance documents including bylaws, policies, meeting agendas and minutes, committee reports, financial statements, meeting schedule, board contact list, and committee rosters and meeting schedules. In addition to the board notebook, your organization should create a board manual that meets your needs. Here on the slide is an example checklist of board manual and orientation items for newly onboarded board members. To develop a working manual that board members use and rely on, first off, don't overwhelm new board members with too much information. Keep each item brief. A 2-paragraph biography of the chief executive is preferable to a 4-page resume, for example, so in that way you can save time. Use the manual as a textbook during board orientation. Encourage board members to read and ask questions about the material. Ask board members to evaluate the usefulness of the manual each year. Revise the contents or format based on their comments. A thorough board manual can include the following materials. So related to board information, things like board members' listing and bios, board members' terms. This refers to term limits, including how many terms can be served consecutively, if applicable. Board statement of responsibilities, committee and task force job and descriptions, policies pertaining to the board on conflicts of interest, insurance coverage, and travel or meeting expense reimbursements, and minutes from recent board meetings. You should also include historical organizational information such as a brief written history and or fact sheet about the organization, articles of incorporation, bylaws, the IRS determination letter for the organization, and a listing of past board members. In addition to that, under the category of strategic framework, you could include things like mission, and you should include things like mission and vision statement, strategic framework or plan, and current annual operating plan. For finance and fundraising, you would include things like prior year annual report, most recent audit report, current annual budget, Form 990, banking resolutions, investment policy, and a list of current major funders. For staff, you would include a staff listing and an organizational chart. For resource development, things such as board fundraising goal for the current year, case statements, a current funder list, sample grant proposal, sponsorship policy, and planned giving program. And other information to include in the manual would include the annual calendar for the organization, website information, and promotional material such as a membership brochure, informational brochure, and advertisements. In order for a board to effectively manage and operate, it must have a guiding document that dictates its rules and regulations. Bylaws are the reflection of the decisions that the organization makes regarding its structure and operational processes. Provide a template for making these decisions, as well as a means for documenting them. Bylaws are the board's structure and operational rulebook. Bylaws should be designed to provide direction and guidance without being so prescriptive that they frustrate or create artificial inefficiency. Along with committee charters and board member and board officer job descriptions, bylaws serve as the organization's operating manual, codifying how the organization and the board operate. And bylaws outline several pieces for the organization, and these include maximum and minimum number of board members, corporate officers, structure and operation of the board, limits on terms of the chair and other elected positions, responsibilities of standing committees, prerogatives and authority of management, protections afforded to directors and officers. Bylaws are subject to regular review and periodic revision. Amendments must be practical and should provide reasonable, thoughtful challenges to change without creating an unbreachable barrier to efficient and effective decision-making. Bylaws also include board meeting dates, times, and attendance policy. And lastly, personnel policies for employees. Leave these kind of things out because they are subject to change. So again, things like personnel policies for employees that are subject to change, leave those out of the bylaws. So anything else that would require a majority vote to change, leave that out of the bylaws. Your board should have a system for analyzing effectiveness and establishing accountability. A vital responsibility of the board is its own self-assessment. And I stated this earlier, you should have at least a biannual opportunity to provide feedback, identify areas for improvement, consider additional supports, and hold each other accountable. And the self-evaluation is necessary for a few reasons. In order, one is to assess the board's effectiveness and identify room for improvement. The process should be transparent and confidential, but it's a good idea for the board to review the tabulated results as a group to collaboratively design action steps that address weak areas. Additionally, board members may also be given the opportunity to reflect on their own performance and identify ways to increase their impact. And finally, don't forget to take the time to acknowledge the contributions of the board and celebrate success together. So looking at board development, the board is responsible for their own development and enhancing their ability to fulfill their obligations to the organization. Board development is the process of providing board members with training and resources to improve the performance and effectiveness of each director and ultimately of the entire organization. A good first step is to use the information gathered through the board evaluation process to reflect on what talents and assets are important to your organization. The board should also be mindful of other resources available to them, as well as opportunities to participate in training and education. So why is board development important? There are a number of reasons. Firstly, it clarifies the board's roles and responsibilities. Clarifying board member duties ensures that the board has a clear vision of its responsibilities and obligations and can provide sufficient governance, and strategic guidance to the organization. It builds a united board team building exercises, facilitated discussions, and training sessions that focus on enhancing communication, collaboration, and problem-solving skills help to build trust and respect among the current members. It shows that the organization values ongoing improvement. By creating a culture of learning, organizations demonstrate they're committed to supporting directors' growth and development. It helps to motivate and retain good board members. When board members feel their contributions are valued and that their personal and professional development is being supported, they are more likely to remain engaged and committed to the organization. It improves performance. Board development enhances the knowledge, skills, and expertise of board members, which helps them make better decisions and provide more effective guidance and oversight, which ultimately results in improved organizational performance. Investing in personnel is as important as investments made in programs or facilities, for example. So to strategize for board development, the board should devise a board development plan. What does the board development plan do? A board development plan enhances the board's effectiveness to operate, lead, and strengthen the organization through formal training, briefings, reading materials, experience sharing, and appropriate challenges. And so we've got a list of key components of a board development plan that I'll share with you. First is clear vision, values, and strategy. These help define the board's goals and required skills based on the organization's strategy. Next is written role descriptions, and I think Donna spoke to this a bit earlier, but the role descriptions provide clear role descriptions for all board members to help board members understand their responsibilities. Next is a skills assessment to identify necessary skills to achieve the organization's strategy. A board should conduct a skills audit of current board members to identify gaps or areas of weakness. Next is addressing skills gaps through a skills audit of board members to develop tailored training programs or workshops, and also consider individual and collective board development needs. This should include a plan to address those gaps identified by the board. Next is to communicate the development plan to ensure all members understand and commit to the development plan. So just making sure that everyone on the board is aware of what the plan is and what their role is in it. Next is a strong onboarding program to implement a strong induction program for new board members to quickly integrate them. A board should establish recruitment and retention strategy. Nonprofit boards face retention as a key challenge in operating effectively. By having a strong onboarding process, it is more likely that new board members can establish trust with the board and vice versa. Also included is an recommended is an annual refresher training. Here, the board can provide annual refresher training to keep skills current. This will help reinforce the board's effectiveness. Lastly is implementing annual reviews. The board should conduct annual reviews to discuss contributions, future plans, and development needs. Good boards insist on accountability. So what if your board struggles to identify its board development needs? Here are 5 steps that you and your board can take to identify those needs. First, conduct a board self-assessment. This can be done through a survey, interview, or other evaluation form. Board members can assess their own skills and competencies as well as the overall effectiveness of the whole board. The next step is to request feedback from stakeholders. Gathering feedback from stakeholders such as staff, donors, and new and existing board members can help identify areas where the board can improve. Similarly to board self-assessment, this can be done through surveys or individual interviews. Next is to conduct a skills audit. Determine which specific skill sets and expertise current board members bring to the board and compare those with the skills and expertise necessary for your organization to succeed. This can help identify a specific area like finance, IT, or marketing where your board could improve. Next is to analyze board performance. You can create a policy indicating a minimum that board members are expected to contribute. This could include board meeting attendance, contributing to meeting discussions, participating in committee meetings, and other measures or benchmarks. And after that, analyze the data and decide where improvements can be made. And then the last step in developing a board development plan is to review best practices and benchmarks for board governance. This can include reviewing governance models, board policies, and board evaluation processes, which can also help determine where your board is falling behind. And based on the results of the assessments and analysis, a board of directors development plan can be created to address the identified development needs. The plan should outline specific goals and activities that will be undertaken to improve the board's skills, knowledge, and effectiveness. Once the board has identified its needs for development, it can begin drafting its plan. So let's cover the key components of a board development plan. First is recruiting board members. Recruitment of new board members usually involves identifying gaps in the board's skills and expertise, creating a recruitment strategy, and reaching potential board members through partners and platforms. Consider recruitment as an ongoing process and ensure that the organization always has a pool of qualified, diverse, and suitable candidates to choose from when selecting new board members. Next is another component is holding elections. Once potential candidates are identified during the recruitment process, members of the organization cast their votes. And this can be done in a number of ways. It can be done at an annual general meeting, through email, through board management software. Be sure to recruit more candidates than there are positions available to ensure a competitive election. And so another component is providing orientation. Board orientation ensures new board members are equipped with the knowledge and resources to effectively fulfill their responsibilities. Key orientation tools to use are, as we discussed earlier, a board manual or orientation packet with an overview of the organization's strategy, mission, history, programs, and governance structure, and a board handbook with board's policies, procedures, and best practices, including information on board meetings, structures of committees, and legal compliance. One suggestion is to pair an existing board member with a new board member to provide mentorship and advice. Next is to provide training. Here are the main types of training and topics they should cover. First is finance, so that includes things like budgeting, financial management, and understanding financial reports, strategic planning, implementing a strategic plan, setting goals, and measuring progress. Next is legal and regulatory compliance, so laws and regulations that impact the organization. And lastly, fundraising and development, which includes donor cultivation, grant writing, and planned giving. And also, as stated earlier, it's advised to conduct an annual refresher training for experienced members to refresh their knowledge and address skills gaps. Then next in the key components is to provide ongoing support and recognition. As a board, be consistent in showing appreciation and recognizing members' contributions to the organization. And this can be done through regular feedback, acknowledging directors' efforts publicly and privately, providing training opportunities, and also networking opportunities. Conduct regular check-ins and evaluations to identify areas where board members may need further support. And then last of the key components is succession planning, which Donna will get into more detail about that in a bit. Succession planning involves identifying and preparing potential candidates for future leadership roles within the organization. This is vital for a few reasons. It provides continuity of leadership and effective governance, mitigates risk of sudden vacancies or turnover, and also allows for smoother transition and onboarding of new board members. Incorporate succession planning into the strategic planning and make it a regular part of board meetings. So Donna will lead you all through a detailed explanation of succession planning. But before we get there, let's take a look at an example of a board development plan. And so pretty straightforward here, but I'll just explain what you're looking at here. In the leftmost column is tasks of the board development plan that the board would have decided on based on what we've just talked about for a number of reasons. And then who is responsible or who is assigned for each task, what the deadline for that is, if there is one, priority level, status, so where is it in progress, and then resources needed to achieve that task, and then lastly, the outcome. So Along with developing a board plan and actually having that board plan in place and implementing it, there also needs to be a process for evaluating that board development plan. So in order to ensure continual improvement, the board should include a method for evaluating progress, and here are 5 steps to evaluate that progress. First is to set clear goals and objectives. Define the goals and objectives of your board development plan. These goals should be measurable, achievable, and aligned with the organization's mission. Next, collect data. Collect data on the progress of the board development plan. This can include fellow board members' evaluations, surveys, annual reviews, board self-assessments, and stakeholder feedback. Then analyze the data. Use various metrics for measuring success, including board composition, and those are things like gender, ethnicity, and professional background, for example. Also engagement, so participation of individual board members in meetings and other activities, and training, things like attendance at conferences, workshops, and board retreats. And then the next step in evaluation is to report those findings. Report findings to the board and relevant stakeholders, share successes and challenges, and make recommendations for improvements. And lastly, adjust the plan accordingly as needed. Use findings from the evaluation to adjust the nonprofit board development plan. If necessary, revise those goals, change strategies, and adjust timelines. Also, keep the board and stakeholders informed of any changes. So we're going to transition here away from the board development plan into more detail about recruitment. Having a formal board recruitment process allows organizations to build an effective, skillful, and diverse board and to fill vacancies efficiently and effectively. To achieve best results, start by defining your recruitment goals, so be clear in your objectives. Analyze the present composition of your board. A board profile can help you determine the specific skills and qualities that would benefit your board. Balance hard and soft skills. Next is ask and reflect on these questions. Your board representative of your community. Do you need more people who have lived experience relevant to your work? Do you need extra fundraising capacity? Is the board diverse enough to benefit from different points of view? And so if your board is lacking the diversity that you seek, relying on personal networks of current board members to identify new candidates will only reinforce that challenge. Other ways of identifying potential board candidates include deep networking through community organizations, your organization's volunteer network, or leaders in your client community. Also, formalized search strategies such as job board posting like LinkedIn or tapping a board search firm or matching program. And if bylaws allow non-board members to serve on committees, inviting prospects to serve on committees to identify future board members. Strategic board recruitment isn't about speed and ease. It really is about investing the time to get it right through an intentional process. Make expectations clear, such as levels of financial contribution and fundraising involvement, and a sense of how much time will be required. And also beware of red flags, such as candidates who might be trying to pad a resume or enhance position in the community without expecting to do much work, or those who expect to be deferred because of their status. Also beware of candidates who might be bringing a personal agenda to the board. So now let's take a look at a few different ways to assess fit for new board members. We'll look at 3 different matrices that can be used. And so this one is about attributes of candidates. And you can see here, it looks at CEO experience, CFO experience, board experience, compliance, legal, and a number of different categories. And you can customize that to what you're looking for in new board members. Next, you can look at traits. And so another list here, leadership, communication, problem solving, decision-making, and strategic thinking. And then a last matrix here on demographics. You can look at these different criteria. So we have gender, ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ plus status or not.
We are going to talk about succession planning now. And succession planning is really part of scenario planning or what if planning. And we often think about or hear about succession planning for the executive director of a nonprofit in terms of what are we going to do if our executive leader has to leave suddenly, or if they have an actual planned decision to leave, and they've given us a year's notice even to build up for that. So, but it is still succession planning is managing those what if scenarios, and so just being prepared ahead of time. And according to the organization Board Source in 2018, they said only 27% of, so less than a third of nonprofits had a written succession plan for executive level staff and for boards, because you can think about succession planning for your boards as much as you can for your staff. And so really that succession plan is a strategic document that outlines that process that you're going to use, that your boards, the committees, the staff members in the organization are going to follow when they're replacing board members. And so you can do succession planning for board members, for board leadership, or for the executive director, which is again where I think we usually associate that term, but we're broadening it out a lot here. Succession planning for the board can include that board matrix that Colby discussed earlier, so that you're constantly having an application of succession plan for your board and assessing every year what are our board looking like on the matrix that matters to us. What skill sets do we have? What skill sets are we missing? What kinds of populations do we have, and who are we missing? And so that's a type of succession planning for boards that you can do, is to use that matrix on a regular basis. And you can assign a committee. I'm on a board that has a committee on trustees, basically. And so that committee's role is to keep in mind, how are we going to move ahead with recruitment? Who do we need on the board next? And what skill sets do we need, and that type of thing. And so you can assign that. Boards should also be mindful in terms of, and this is kind of anti-succession planning, I guess, although it is succession planning, but organizations say we have board members that are not active or who have been on the board for a long time and they're just not doing anything. And how do we get rid of them? How do we gracefully ask them to step off the board? And so when the board is mindful that and deems it necessary that there is a board member who needs to be relieved of duty, so, for lack of a better word, a succession plan that lays out in it what you do if somebody is inactive prepares the board then to take appropriate action. It gives them a policy tool that they can use to do that. And so your bylaws could actually include something in there that talks about what happens when a board member is inactive. How do we manage that? That could be a part of your bylaws. At the very least, your bylaws should have in it, express in them what are the term limits. And so it should outline term limits that you have for board members and for officer positions as well, because those term limits then give you an opportunity to step in and have that tough conversation with a board member if you need to at the end of their term. But again, even outside term limits, if you have some sort of process in your board manual, then you can help manage that. So that's just a word about inactive or members that are not being responsible. So a comprehensive plan for both types of will address both types of departures around an organization, whether there's an emergency departure, an unexpected resignation from the board or from an executive level staff member, or somebody that has to be removed from a position suddenly. Then you've got an emergency departure and you've got to be able to deal with that. And then you can also have a planned departure where a term limit is approaching or somebody has announced early on, if it's a staff member, an executive level staff member, that they're going to be leaving the organization. And so the goal of any of this succession planning is to really minimize those negative impacts that are caused by departures and maintain a consistent workflow for the organization and keep it functioning, even if the full contingent of the staffing and board structure is not there. So there are some questions to consider, and this is actually, there's a really great tool that the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City has on their website. And when we send these slides out to you all as notes, you'll have this website information, but it is a blow-by-blow kind of tool that you can use to prepare your organization for succession planning. And they're focusing more so in that tool on executive level leadership succession planning, but there are some important questions that they raise that organizations should consider when they're talking about succession planning. And so they should know, is there an existing succession plan? Is there one that has been previously adopted and approved by the board? And the board should take a look at succession plans and approve those for the organization, even if it relates to staff. but any of the succession planning should be, the board should be engaged in that. Does the organization have any leadership candidates already identified? And is that talent prepared, or are there good internal candidates? And so particularly in terms of an unplanned loss of an executive leader, it's a good idea for board members or even the executive leader to kind of have identified somebody that could step into that role in an interim position so that the work of the organization continues forward. And so it could be that, there was a previous director or a board member that had been part of the organization for a long time that would agree to step into an interim role for the ED if that need ever arose. There could be an internal person that has been working closely with the executive leader over the years and could step as an interim position into that role as well. And so thinking about those good internal candidates and that kind of thing. In the event of emergency, does anybody know who will be the acting executive until the board can appoint someone and then hire a permanent leader? So there should be somewhere in this plan, it should be written down who that person is so that we can, you can bring that forward as here's our temporary solution to this issue. And then anytime that you, especially with the changeover of an executive director, you're going to face potential financial ramifications for that. And so is your organization equipped to handle a decline in income during transition? You ask yourself that question. Are board and staff prepared to step into the role of the relationships that the ED may have had with funders, or the way that the executive director was, bringing income in? Are there ways that can be handed off? So asking those questions about that. Has the organization built trust among funders that the organization can continue without the current executive? Executive directors become the faces of their organizations in so many ways, and it's an important role that they play. But are they extending those relationships and empowering other staff to be seen by funders, talked to by funders, so that those folks who are supporting the organization realize that there's actually a structure in place that keeps the organization going. It's not just one person. So, how is your organization building trust specifically among funders like that? Is the board capable and committed to hiring a highly effective new executive director? So if you have board members that have never, if you do that board assessment and you go, we've never had anybody really doing much with that kind of high level hiring, you might need to think about bringing in a consultant firm to help you hire and replace that ED. So, or train your board, get them trained ahead of time, make sure that you have somebody on the board who has had some hiring experience, who can help coordinate that search committee and help with the hiring process, bring some real skills to that. Will the organization lose institutional knowledge and important contacts? And so we touched base a little bit about that with funders, in terms of contacts, but, for organizations that have had executive leaders and even board members that have been part of that organization for years and years and years, they are often carrying institutional knowledge that's not written down anywhere, or, that, they're the go-to person if you say, well, what happened back in 1992 when blah, 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 then, how do we capture that information if it's important enough to bring forward? What skills and duties need to be replicated, especially with an executive director? And can those be developed among other staff? Is there any kind of cross-training that can happen so that in an absence, somebody could step into that role and not have to have a huge learning curve? Now, there's always going to be a learning curve for folks that are having to step in unexpectedly, but what can we do to minimize that learning curve as much as we can? So what skills and duties, are they recorded somewhere that these are the skills and duties that need to be replicated, or that are required for this executive level position, and how do we develop those among other staff? What other positions will leave the organization vulnerable if those employees depart? So it's not always about the executive director leaving. It could be that you have a really strong chief financial officer who, has really managed the resources and been the right-hand person of that executive director. And if that person leaves, then that area, the finance area, could suffer. And so what plan exists to replace that person or to pick up the pieces that that person was holding until you could get us another strong person into that role. We often run organizations now with those types of teams. And so any loss on an executive team could be significant to an organization. So these are succession planning readiness questions. If you can't answer yes or don't have an answer to many of these questions, that means you need to do some work on your succession plan. And again, I think that the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City has a very good resource in that planning toolkit. So why is succession planning important? It allows the board to obtain top talent for board members or executive directors. So if you're thinking ahead in terms of either, how you're going to replace board members, again, thinking back to that board matrix and what are the skill sets that we need? What kind of diversity do we want on our board? What are the qualities that we want, characteristics that we want on our board? So you're able to act proactively with that. And it's the same with staff and with the executive director. For boards, it ensures that diverse board composition, resulting in more inclusive thinking with the board. It maintains the balance of power on the board to do this succession planning so that you are moving new people on and off of the board, being ready to onboard people who have the interest and the skills to be able to really bring their power to the board. And so it maintains that balance of power that way. Reinforces trust with stakeholders, including funders. If funders know that you have in place a succession plan, then they're not going to be as worried about your program sustainability because funders are often saying, how's this work going to continue even after our money's gone? This also can result in a more seamless transition when you're bringing on, and here we're talking again, board and staff. That transition can be more seamless if you're planning ahead for it and you have the scenario lined out about how that's going to work out. It allows for the careful selection of a new leader so that the board is not feeling like it has to rush in rehiring, especially if we're thinking about the executive director or the CEO position. You have the time because you've got a plan in place and how we're going to manage the organization as we make this succession change. We can really find the right leader to fit this position, somebody who's aligned with your mission, with your vision, and your values of your organization, as well as having the skill sets that you're looking for. Because sometimes that mission, values, and vision alignment can be almost more important than skills. And that's part of ensuring that the new leader is a good cultural fit as well with the organization. A good succession plan equips the incoming leader with everything they need to succeed in their role. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is later when I talk about the importance of going deep in the organization with your succession planning. And so there are some kind of key steps for succession planning. For succession planning, you want to align your board members around the plan. So you're going to gather input among your board members and share their views on what the leadership needs to be for the organization. And, that the board needs to have a vision of what good leadership is for the organization. And then the board could create a committee to oversee the process of creating a succession plan and establish very clear responsibilities and a charge for that committee. Like, are we going to develop criteria for who we would look for to fill this role? If someone leaves, what are candidate profiles? If we had a perfect candidate, what would that look like? And then in the case of an actual succession, then they would also assign who is it that's going to lead that search for candidates. And so will it be a committee that gets appointed by the board to do that, or will the board chair lead that? And so it just depends on how your board wants to do that. That would be written into the succession plan. And then the board would need to conduct an annual assessment. And we've already talked about the board assessments, but conduct an annual assessment to anticipate upcoming vacancies. And this is specifically really thinking about board membership. And so, like, what are the expected vacancies that we have for board? And you can also say that for staff. Are there any expected vacancies for important key level staff that we need to be thinking about? But then also include in that emergency planning. And so, developing plans for both the planned kind of retirement and of the executive director or other staff, and also dealing with term limits and also then dealing with unexpected vacancies. And then assessing also alignment with complying with the bylaws and ensuring that the bylaws cover all the types of transitions that might happen, and that compliance with those bylaws is then maintained. And so your bylaws might want to have some sort of language in there about transition of board members, transition of the board chair, transition of top level leadership of the organization. What are the key roles that you're going to be thinking about for transition? And so that would be part of the transition planning as well. Focus on positions like the executive director. If you're a large organization and you have high-level program directors, you might think about that. You may think about major gift officers if you're in an organization that has that kind of structure, so that, you know, those gift officers could take away a lot of the relationships if we're not nurturing those relationships with other staff. And also with those board members, as we're saying. And then just having those contingency plans for unplanned departures by identifying and kind of having in your back pocket potential candidates that could step into those roles. If there are people within the organization or people on the board that could temporarily step into a role, maybe in an unpaid position, that would be possibly pretty tricky, but you know, or are there community members that could be hired in temporarily or something to fulfill a role? So that kind of contingency plan for emergencies. And then really understanding, part of the, I think, process too is understanding and defining your culture and ensuring that everybody understands the nonprofit's culture and the leadership qualities that you're going to want and expectations that you're going to want in a board, well, either a board member that you're bringing on or in staff that you're trying to hire. And for all of those positions, you should have, as part of a succession plan, you should have job descriptions. And the current leaders in those roles should probably look at those job descriptions and make sure that they're up to date. And then refer also, as you're doing succession planning, to any strategic plans that you have, and make sure that that you understand what's going to be needed to forward the work and carry forward the work of a strategic plan. And if you're doing a strategic plan in considering strategic plans, and you have a planned departure of an executive level position, and here I'm talking staff position, then you would want to make part of that strategic planning process, how are we going to approach that if that is coming a year down the road, 2 years down the road? I mean, if you've got an executive leader who is able to give you that much notice, then you can really work with that and do some very creative internal succession planning with bringing staff members along, or really take the time to recruit the talent that you need in that top position. And so then that brings us to the notion of recruiting, cultivating and recruiting talent. And so it is developing and training those current staff and volunteers who show potential for leadership roles, and also providing training programs and mentorship opportunities to just build leadership development within the organizations themselves. And then beginning that recruitment as early as you can when you know that staff departure is going to happen, at least 6 months in advance for planned vacancies. And of course, you're going to have to do it immediately if you are in an emergency situation. But if you can give it a year, I've seen organizations actually like the person would announce a departure, and then a year before that person leaves, they start recruiting for the role. And they're even able to bring on for a period of time that new leader so that they can work together. As long as that doesn't become an issue where you have a situation where the new leader's not wanting to or the previous leader's not wanting to let go, you know. And so, you know, in terms of working with internal staff, you can also prioritize soft skills development for them so that they are able to fit in or step into those leadership roles. If they have, many times your internal staff will have a lot of program knowledge and they'll understand how the programs are run, but they may not have those soft skill types of leadership things that an executive level leader needs to have to work effectively and oversee a staff team. And so just knowing that that you can develop those. And then when you onboard in a succession plan, you onboard your new leader. There's a whole process of announcing the new leader internally and hosting a welcoming event and arranging a training day with the current leader to, you know, get them a training day for how does the board work, and working in terms of this being a board training, you know, working with the new leader in the board to train them on and get them into the culture of the board and talk about the policies and procedures and the bylaws and all that. And then just allowing that new leader some time to adjust to that. So, those types of things, I guess, are covered in the small bullets there, but yeah, so that onboarding process is part, actually, understanding how you're going to onboard people is part of that succession planning as well. Let's talk a little bit then about emergency succession planning. And the whole idea is to prepare for it before there is an overwhelming emergency, because when you're scrambling in the moment, it's just going to make things a whole lot harder. And so some of the pieces that you need to have in place, and you could create a template around this even, you know, you need to have a communication plan in place. Know ahead of time, who is it that you need to notify when there's a sudden change in leadership in your organization? What is, and this, you may not know exactly ahead of time what the public statement is that you're going to make, but you could have some idea of what the talking points are going to be, that we have a plan in place. We are going to be fine as an organization. We regret to see this person leave, but we are going to replace them, you know, with an able and willing and competent leader. You want to have an internal staff member assigned to be as an interim executive, potentially. Empower them to become a key spokesperson for the organization until the new executive is hired. The board can actually work to recommend and have a plan for what would we do for temporary additional compensation for this person if they are in this leadership role for a period of time. There needs to be a lot of thought put into that for nonprofit succession planning, because there was an organization that I was working with once, and there was a sudden departure, and the person who stepped into the role helped actually make the plan for succession planning. But when that person stepped into the role, she was like, I'm getting another like $20 a month to do this additional work. And so, you know, there's a lot of thought that should go into what is it really going to be like for a person to step into this role of an executive role when they haven't been in that before. And then you want to be very clear to define what are the responsibilities, authority, and decision-making limits of that interim person's role. Like what power do they have in the organization, and what responsibilities do they have? Very, very clear about that, so that they're not making major changes when they're really only meant to be there for a short time. You want to identify board support and supervision for the interim over that short-term period. So who, and probably it's going to be the board chair that's going to work with that interim executive, but you know, you want to really make sure that you've identified that, and then schedule regular meetings. The board chair or whoever it is that is appointed to do this should be having regular meetings with that interim person, because the full weight of that organization should not be on that person's shoulders unless they are moved full-time into that executive level position. They're a stopgap, and they should be supported that way. And then identify an executive search task force or committee, so that you can then start that full-time search process and conduct that process and make a recommendation to the board as quickly as you can. This search committee can comprise just of board members, or it can be board and staff, depending on how you want to structure that as a board. And the board should make that decision as well, if it's not written into the emergency succession plan already. So you could have that written in if you want. But then there's also departure defined succession planning. And this is about the current executive director letting go and preparing the way. Somebody referred this to me one time as, you know, an executive wants to make sure they are leaving the organization in good hands when they leave. Yes, it's going to be difficult sometimes to step down from a position or step away from a position, especially if a person has held it for a long time. But if we do good succession planning, we're going to be leaving that organization in good hands. And so you want to have in place a strategic plan that includes objectives for leadership development talent. And these are not things that we often think about when we're doing strategic planning for our organizations. But especially if we know that there's going to be a departure, but even if we don't know that, there should be a staff development portion of your strategic plan that says, how are we continually growing and developing our staff so that we are developing the skills for them to be able to move forward in the organization. There should be those assessments. So, we're saying assess, assess, assess. We keep talking about that, but assess both the executive director and the board, define those areas for improvement, and sharpen those areas so that you're strengthening the organization. This is, and we're talking about that assessment, it is really as much about strengthening the organization as it is strengthening those individuals. You get a good, strong board and a good, strong executive team, that organization can weather it fine when an ED has to leave. Be sure that you're conducting annual evaluations for your staff to ensure that they have the necessary skills to sustain the organization's work and this is where we're going deep in the organization, so that they can sustain that work going forward, even if the executive person leaves. Develop senior management into a high-performing team who can address challenges together. So if you have a large enough organization that you have an executive team, or you can combine some other higher level staff with executive board members to really sustain the organization's work, then you're going to, again, be able to weather that change a lot better. Cultivating staff and board member relationships with external stakeholders, including those funders. So the relationship piece of transition, leadership transition and leadership succession is really important, because if you lose those important relationships, that can result in a ripple effect of losing funding, of losing clients, of losing, just potential board members. Those people who can be resources and supporters of your organization, you just don't want to lose them. This came out of the Federal Reserve Bank thing too, that their toolkit, that you want to create financial reserves to cover a minimum of 6 months of operating capital, knowing that you're going to be bringing a new staff person on board who's leading the organization. Set them up for success over that first 6 months so they can get their feet on the ground and start meeting those funders and developing those relationships, and that there is a cushion in there for that operating capital. You want to develop awareness throughout the staff and throughout the board for your financial systems, and make sure those financial systems meet industry standards so that your organization is well heeled financially for when there's a transition. And then develop operational manuals for administrative systems and ensure they are accessible and current. And so are there specific routine things that are happening either through the systems that exist or that the ED is doing that could be written down, and there's a job manual for it. So when a new person, either an interim or a full-time person, steps into that role, they have a guidebook to help them move forward. And those need to be kept, again, so they are accessible and current. And then keeping the executive director, when you're thinking about that leadership position, that position description updated so that when you're hiring, you're not having to scramble to update the position to reflect the true reality of where the organization is. And I had mentioned earlier that true succession goes deep. So providing staff development for sustainability of your organization is important. And this is the work that the executive director can bring to the board as part of succession planning. So the executive director, because they're the one who is going to be really working with the staff, can say, here is my professional development plan for my staff, and here's why I think these things are important. And they can report to that to the board, and just say, basically have the board understand how this organization is grooming staff to be more successful in their positions and grooming them for future leadership in some ways. So, and why that deeper staff development is important is that it increases employee engagement. They're probably going to stick around longer and be there to step into leadership roles instead of getting frustrated and leaving. It's going to create a culture of learning within your organization. It's going to increase your organization's efficiency simply because, people are going to be working better. And it will help staff grow not only in their roles, but grow so they can expand into future roles. So going deep with succession planning, it's more than just about replacing that executive director. And then some how-tos for doing, staff development. Staff development's not always inexpensive. but you can leverage some nonprofit specific development resources, books. So we actually here at Brushy Fork just started, we do a book club every once in a while. We just started reading a new book that's helping us learn about some of the work that we're doing. And so we're providing reading time at work, and then we're holding book discussions among the staff to help develop kind of really deepen the knowledge around some of the areas where we're wanting to develop our own knowledge. Find online opportunities that are no cost or low cost. We actually, as part of this initiative with Berea College Appalachian Fund, we're about to make available to all the grantees a list of online resources that are no cost, and really no cost, most of them. And I think there may be one or two that could be very low cost on there, but most of these are no cost. That are online learning opportunities or tools and manuals that you all can use to improve your skills. And so those things are out there online. They're not, it's nice to have somebody vet them for you, but find those and make those available to your staff and give your staff time to do them. And then subscribing to sector specific journals. If you're in a healthcare organization or you're in an organization that provides services to homeless people, I know we've got somebody here that's doing that. Then, you know, you can, if you can find sector specific magazines or journals or discussion groups that to stay up to date on trends, that also is helpful. So, and can be low cost or no cost. Enhance your existing training programs. Consider sector focused materials to include in onboarding for both staff and for board members. Keep all your existing training up to date and applicable as well. And offer then, if you can, external development opportunities. There's nothing that can help a staff member as much as going away and getting something and then bringing it back to the organization to share with other organization members. And so online courses, in-person courses, conferences, and then have the important piece of that is that person doesn't just then take that and hold it internally, but they come and they follow up with other staff and they share about their learning opportunities and how they're going to apply it.